Hello and welcome to Media Lit, where we treat each piece of media like great literature. I'm your host, Randy Elaine, and joining me as always is my co-host and partner in crime, Kris Ingersoll. Kris, how you doing tonight?
So good, Randy. Thrilled to be podcasting with you as always. Thanks for getting us together again for another great conversation. Tonight's going to be a heavy one, but a good one for sure.
Absolutely. And Kris, I see that we are not alone tonight. You've brought us a new guest and a kindred spirit. Who's joining us in the room tonight?
Randy, I'm thrilled to announce that we've got a new friend of the pod with us this evening, really lifelong friend of mine, a gentleman that I've known since I was 10 years old. I'll save the actual story of our first meeting and the song we sang for another podcast. But suffice to say, this man has shown me a way to balance cool and kind that I've always admired and really desired to live alongside of. Simon J. is a lifelong friend. Really excited to talk to this brilliant gentleman today as we dig into some Kurt Vonnegut.
Absolutely. Now I'm meeting Simon for the first time this evening, but he's already made a great impression on me. I know one thing we have in common is we both want Kris to read books by Kurt Vonnegut, which is a great way to start any relationship. Kris, I just wanted to hit you with a little Kurt Vonnegut quote before we jump into the first segment. This is not from the homework that I assigned for tonight. This is from Slaughterhouse-Five, but I thought you might really love the vibe of this quote. And this is Kurt Vonnegut reflecting on the biblical story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and specifically Lot's wife. So here's the quote. "And Lot's wife, of course, was told not to look back, where all those people and their homes had been, but she did look back. And I love her for that, because it was so human."
Amen, amen. I love that. And it's actually more relevant to this episode than maybe, I'm not sure if you realize, because later I'll talk a little bit about the influence of the title of the piece we'll be speaking of today. And I was going to be asking you a little bit about how frequently Vonnegut is working biblical references into his works. Simon, once upon a time, lent me a book. You referenced that he's been trying to get me to read Vonnegut for some time. He gave me Man Without a Country. He said, "You got to read this." I had just moved to New York City, and I didn't read it. I didn't tell him I didn't read it. Simon, I'm here to confess to you now two things. I didn't read that book. I still have that book. I have your copy of that book. Can you forgive me for that?
Absolutely forgive you, and it is incredibly obvious you didn't read that book, bro.
You thought you
Nice.
got away with it.
Yeah. Dang. So yeah, I don't have any personal experience with Vonnegut. I didn't read that book that Simon lent me, and that quote you just hit me with is the first thing I've ever heard from Slaughterhouse-Five, which I'm always embarrassed to admit in well-read company. So really excited to be here. But now I really want to hear more from you guys about why it is you need me to dig into Vonnegut. So Randy, let's start with you, bud. What's like an early or important memory that you've got connected to Kurt?
I can remember exactly how I got into Kurt Vonnegut. So I was in 10th grade. However, this book was not a part of my school curriculum. I had to do a research paper in 10th grade. My history teacher assigned a topic to me, which was the firebombing of Dresden, Germany. I also had an English class where I had to complete some independent reading every month. So I had done my initial research, and I read, there's this book about a survivor of the Dresden firebombing. And I was like, aha, I will get this approved for my English class. I will then blow my history teacher's mind by having read an entire novel to add into my larger research, which was a really clever idea. The only problem is I had no idea what I was signing up for. This book was so abstract, so cerebral, so weird. I was looking for easy little tidbits for a 10th grader's history paper. Meanwhile, the main character of this story is hanging out with aliens called Tralfamadorians, traveling through time, and I didn't know what was happening. All I really knew was that I liked it because it was a little bit funny, it was a little bit sarcastic, and I had this sense that I maybe wanted to sound like that. I wanted to be able to play those games that Kurt Vonnegut was playing with language. I encountered the book again in college at UMass Amherst. I took a course called America at War with a professor I really loved named Bob Dow. I would not be the type of person who would design a podcast about delving deep into literature if I had never taken Bob Dow's class. Looking at that book again through fresh eyes with a really great guide, comparing it to all these other great war stories, brought it to a whole new level. And the final layer to this, I know you asked me for one memory, but here I am rolling on and on. But then I very suddenly found myself teaching by accident. I'll spare you that whole story. But sure enough, within my first year of teaching, Kurt Vonnegut passed away. And one of the first posthumous publications was a book called Armageddon in Retrospect. I went out, I bought it, I read it, and I've really been carrying the torch for Vonnegut ever since. So yeah, that's my brief history of my lifelong love affair with Kurt Vonnegut's work.
Brilliant. Not surprised to hear that once his hooks were in you, you just kept going after more. I have one question for you before I pitch this to Simon. Have you ever had to pronounce, was it Tralfamadorians?
Tralfamadorians.
Madorians. Had you had to pronounce that out loud before in life, and were you trepidatious to do so now live on a podcast?
I was not trepidatious. I was trying to cut myself off from talking, which is a problem I have. If any current or former students have stumbled upon this podcast by accident, they're nodding their heads in agreement and understanding with that problem that I have. No, but sure enough, one of my teaching professors, after I went back to grad school to work toward my master's degree in teaching, told me that I should not be designing units of study on Kurt Vonnegut books because it was not relatable to the kids. And sure enough, when I got my next job, which is still my current job, the first book I had to teach was Slaughterhouse-Five. It was like we were destined to be. So I've been pronouncing Tralfamadorian for years. I've developed a whole theory that high school students will not pronounce more than 4 syllables, even if they know how to do it, because they find it too embarrassing. So I do a lot of, kind correcting, right? I would not be a good Vonnegut fan if I were really up on my high horse about it.
Dude, so glad I asked. So glad I asked. What about you, Simo? Did Vonnegut come up in your illustrious education, or how did you come to Man Without a Country, at least?
So much of Randy's story is like almost ridiculously relatable. I feel like Vonnegut, when he first came onto my radar, I was basically like too young. I wasn't intellectually ready to actually understand anything really about what he represented, what his books were actually like. It was just one of these names that had power to it. Just as like a young person around books, interested in books at all. And I was like fairly intimidated by it. And I think my very first memory is being like sincerely impressed that a peer of mine, shout out Eric McDowell, because
Wow.
he was, there you go, because he was either doing a major project for like an AP English class, or like I have this memory of him like reading it. And I remember in my brain being like, yeah, he has more IQ points than you. It's okay. Like he's ready for that. And now you really know that you're not, because you really admire and respect Eric McDowell. So this is proof. The proof is in the pudding. So you're not ready. And to double down on this, I read Cat's Cradle for school. And looking back, I was like, why did I pick that book? And then I was, nervous and preparing for this podcast. And I was like, let me make sure I remember like what that book actually was about. Absolutely do not remember anything. The reason I picked that book and what I'll always remember, and I actually look forward to revisiting it and reading it as an adult, is that Ice Nine was horrifying and really cool.
Hmm.
What a dope weapon. And then I'm reading the Wikipedia summary and I was like, bro, that's all you got out of it?
Oh no.
And and it is so funny because, not to get too deep or not to skip ahead, but my young adolescent brain was seduced by the most violent, destructive aspect of that book. I was like, I want to read Cat's Cradle because I think it's about war and I think it has this really cool
Hmm.
futuristic weapon. And that's what my young brain got. And when we get to talking about Wailing Shall Be in All Streets, I feel like Vonnegut is putting so much effort to acknowledge that that's an aspect of war, the war machine, and incredibly harmful, naive, and shallow. I was harmful, naive, and shallow.
I don't want you to feel badly about just kind of feeling that aura of Kurt Vonnegut. There is a reference I was going to make later in the pod, but there is a very bad movie from, I believe, 1998, which I have not watched in a long time. Did either of you ever see the film Disturbing Behavior?
Oh man, it sounds so familiar. Yeah.
It's a super familiar title. Who's in it?
So Disturbing Behavior was a Katie Holmes vehicle, and I didn't bother to research exactly what it was about. Like the high school kids were like possessed by some kind of force, and there's this mysterious janitor character, and he's in a wildly inappropriate way, like trying to put on that he has some sort of mental handicap, and it's just all as bad as you could imagine it. But the
Mhm.
way they realize he's faking it is they see like a copy of Slaughterhouse-Five in his back pocket, and they're like, "Oh, this guy reads Kurt Vonnegut. He must be lying." And it's the stupidest thing ever. But there's also a certain reality to it. And as for that, only picking up on the violence, the very first test I gave as an English teacher was on the play Julius Caesar. And I had no idea really how to give a test yet. I wasn't even a fully licensed teacher yet. But I remember there was one question every single kid got correct on a test that they struggled to do well on. And that was the fact they all remembered that Portia committed suicide by swallowing hot coals, because
Mhm.
that violent streak stuck with them. So I think you struck on something human and true. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it makes me think of one of my favorite authors is Chuck Palahniuk, but most certainly I was reading things like Lullaby or of course Fight Club way too young and being interested in that and enjoying that for probably a lot of the wrong reasons. It always blows my mind to revisit one of his books today. Well, more specifically, Simon, you had wanted me to read Man Without a Country. I think it was right when I was moving to New York. Why that? Do you remember why you recommended the book?
Yeah. So I believe, and I'm so sorry if I'm getting the timing wrong, but it was around this time that you said something I'll probably never forget. And it was that you were going to stop watching The Patriots and you had increased, I don't want to say found, because I don't think it was like, it's not that literal. It's not 0 to 100, but you were with much more intention developing, understanding, pursuing a relationship with God.
Hmm.
And my boy, who's getting to know God, is moving to New York. And I feel like Vonnegut does such a good job of making existential crises approachable and well thought out and earnest. And I think that there's essays and in that collection, and just Vonnegut in general is like a great companion to like that I mean, not to be too dramatic, but like that human condition. So I think that's why I recommended that book for you.
Man, I'm not surprised at all to hear that reasoning. I was almost going to include it in my intro to you, the way in which you have been sort of an influencer in my life, whether you realize it or not. You have always been a person who has pointed me towards the cool, and I don't mean the trendy. I mean the cool. And it's no surprise to me that you were providing guidance even in this really transitional time of my life. I really appreciate that. Wanting to introduce me to something like Vonnegut. What about you, Randy? You're only just getting to know me, and you've already, since maybe not our first meeting, but at least in the preps for this podcast all along the way, continually pitched Vonnegut and asked me, "What about this one? Have you read that one?" So why is it that you are so passionate about folks digging into some Kurt Vonnegut?
So Simon gave me a slightly different entry point than what I planned in my notes. But I think it's interesting, Simon, that you like brought up this idea that Kris was on some sort of a faith journey, because on the one hand, Kurt Vonnegut, not a religious guy.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, fascinated by religion. He loved to write about Jesus as a figure, and sometimes it wasn't based out of religious faith, but there are fingerprints all over his books. And in fact, I brought an artifact to the podcast. This is a children's book that is sitting beside me. It's called Sun, Moon, Star. Basically, it is a secular telling of the birth of Christ from the perspective of Jesus. And what it's trying to capture in a non-religious way is how beautiful the concept of a God putting themselves into a human body to be that fallible is like the theme of this children's book. And I even wrote an inscription in it for my son when I gave him this book when he was very little. And it just says, "I want to share Kurt Vonnegut with you because he always writes about the fact that all people deserve to be loved. I feel the same way, and I hope that you will too." And that is the inscription in the book. It's a very nice hardcover copy, and I hope that he will keep it forever. It'll mean something to him. And I don't see anything else in my notes that says it better than that. So I'm going to say that's why I want anyone to read Vonnegut. Whether you're my new friend from a book signing, or my child, like I want everyone to feel that way about the world.
Man, that's absolutely beautiful. It puts the sharing of this in a totally different context. It makes me want to say thank you. So thank you, brother.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Obviously, Vonnegut has had an impact on you. Can you elaborate a little bit further about the ways in which your values or even your interests have been developed through your exposure to his novels and short stories?
So I think the first thing that means a lot to me about Vonnegut is the fact that he is so direct and disinterested in bullshit. He wants to call a spade a spade. He will call people out for their flaws, but he still has the capacity to see what they're capable of, or to see what could be great about someone, or to see why they are redeemable. And that bluntness of his style is something that means a lot to me. So a way he captures this in his books is not really being interested in traditional villains. I'm quoting Slaughterhouse-Five once again. He talks about studying anthropology in college when he first went to school. And he says, "Another thing they taught you was that nobody was ridiculous or bad or disgusting. Shortly before my father died, he said to me, you never wrote a story with a villain in it." And that's a really popular Vonnegut theme, that these battles are internal. And I'm hitting you with a lot of Slaughterhouse-Five. If it's not clear yet, I think the main reason I recommended Wailing Shall Be in All Streets is because it paves the way to read Slaughterhouse-Five. It was not very subtle. But that opens with a chapter that is, part autobiographical, partly fictionalized, that line that authors play with in fiction. But he says a couple of things. "I have told my sons that they are not under any circumstances to take part in massacres. and that the news of massacres of enemies is not to fill them with satisfaction or glee. I have also told them not to work for companies which make massacre machinery, and to express contempt for people who think we need machinery like that. Um, there's that bluntness and being open and being honest and saying what you think your values should be, for better and or for worse. It's wired into who I am at this point.
I really love that because I think what you're describing, I mean, you keep saying for better or for worse, but ultimately you're describing righteousness, right? This kind of blunt, honest communication, especially when ultimately care for the individual and for the relationship is at the heart of it, right? You're not talking about being like rude or not having a filter in a way that you're not afraid to offend somebody. That's not what you're describing. You're describing a bluntness that really builds trust, that shows love and care for another person. I really dig that. What about you, Sai? Anything about your exposure to Vonnegut have an influence on you?
I think I relate a lot to what Randy was saying. And for me, Vonnegut is still something that is like, I feel like I've barely scratched the surface. Like, as I was alluding to about my impression of him back in the day, it absolutely still maintains that I'm smart enough to know what I don't know, whatever that phrase is. Like, I know that there are people who, and I think we might be talking to one, have like truly dove deep, and like he's, I guess, worthy of that. And maybe he would say everyone's worthy of that. But yeah, but I'm not on that level. I'm not that guy. So I feel like I'm actually somewhere right in the middle between what Randy is describing and like this journey that Kris is being kind of shown or tugged along to. So how he's affected me just in a most personal way is I feel like I'm ready. I feel like that's what participating in this podcast and getting a chance to listen to like essentially an expert talk about him. I feel like I feel like I'm ready and I understand what all the hype was about. And that's where I'm at.
Love that. I love that Vonnegut is something that you kind of need to grow into. And I also agree that once Randy pulled out the children's book that is dedicated to his son, I realized that he's on a totally different plane of Vonnegut fandom than probably most.
It is an obsession. Yeah.
Well, then, Randy, I'll really challenge that. Do you have a favorite? I mean, maybe I can guess based on the pod so far, but do you have a diehard you can read one more thing for the rest of your life Vonnegut piece?
Sure. I mean, it's Slaughterhouse-Five. You can hear me and a zillion other people talk about it. I was going to throw another couple of quick recommendations your way. Another novel that I love is called God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, in which the wealthy trust fund son of a successful family gets the crazy idea that he could use his family's wealth and fortune to help people. So the folks on the business end use that belief, basically, to use the legal system to prove that he is not like mentally stable and fit to oversee the family fortune, because only a crazy person would would think to use their wealth in such a way. You've got Mother Night, which features there. For folks who don't know, there is a whole Vonnegut verse out there. Different iterations of the Tralfamadorians exist in different novels. There are lots of recurring characters like the science fiction writer Kilgore Trout. But in Mother Night, you get the whole story of a guy named Howard W. Campbell Jr. He appears in Slaughterhouse-Five as an American who has joined the Nazi Party, and he is doing propaganda for the Nazis and trying to enlist captured American soldiers to fight on the Russian front. In Mother Night, you learn he is actually a double agent working for the government. But he reaches the conclusion that even if he was working for the government, he still put so much harm into the world that he decides he deserves to be punished nevertheless. And then Simon already shouted out Cat's Cradle, which is a great one. It features a fictional religion called Baconanism, but there is one term that I was thinking of when Simon mentioned your waning Patriots fandom, and that is the concept of a grand falloon, which is a catch-all term for basically a false community that people have endowed false meaning upon, where there isn't any that really exists. And he cites, most religions in all countries as examples, but he also mentions Hoosiers, and I'm sure, Patriots Nation would fall under that moniker as well.
Not surprising. Not surprising. Well, we've definitely tossed roses or flowers upon Vonnegut's name all evening so far. Can we objectively highlight any flaws that we've found in our experience? Simon, anything that you would call out?
Oh man, I'm gonna be such a softie about this because what is his novel? Titans? Please help me out here, Randy.
Sirens of Titan.
Yes. So something about that book is I've been going through, I'm trying to read like some big names that I'm like, I need to get under my belt. I need to see. So I did like literally Crime and Punishment. I love that. And then there were 2 books on this journey that I started and gave up. One was that one, something about it, and I think it was personal to me. I don't know if it was, if I remember correctly, it was character heavy. And then there's like planet hopping, and it just lost me. And so I stopped. But I really think that's a flaw with me, because I'm sure if I stuck to it, things would start to click into place. The other one was War and Peace. That was extremely overwhelming. I don't know if you guys have ever tried to tackle that. That was something else. I guess that's the only flaw, because I only want to speak with what I've experienced, because I've loved what I have like comprehended that I've read by him. Yeah. So that's all I really got for flaws. So I certainly forgive him.
Yeah, I dig that. It sounds like, to Randy's point, there's been a Vonnegut verse building, and anytime you're trying to jump into somebody's body of work in the finite, when there is such a big picture out there, I can imagine it's tough to hold on to. It's almost like the same critique you might give of like an individual MCU movie, which like on its own merits might be fine, but it's doing so much to be connected to the other things, or it's just so big by nature of being a part of that universe that it can be tough to grasp onto. What about you, Randy?
Yeah, I mean, listen, as you know, I love Kurt Vonnegut. I love this guy. But he's full of flaws, and I don't think he would try to hide that fact. Listen, I keep hinting at like my own struggles with how I approach relationships, and I think there's a point to which bluntness and openness are important and necessary. But I think sometimes it's possible to lack the patience that might help you cross the line in a relationship. And Kurt Vonnegut certainly had an ego. There is an ego at work there. There's also a kind, loving soul who would take in his nieces and nephews when, his sister passed away. But there's an ego there. There's frustration. There's anger. Vonnegut had a lot of demons he was grappling with, like everyone. He had at least 1 or 2 documented suicide attempts, things like that. He struggled at different points in his life. I forget which introduction to which Vonnegut collection I was reading, but I deduced from the reading that Kurt Vonnegut was actually living in Northampton, Massachusetts, probably while I was at UMass at one point, and probably hanging out at this bar called the Tunnel Bar that I walked by a bazillion times. But, if I had wandered into that bar and seen Kurt Vonnegut there, I don't think he was in a place where he was going to want to sit down and have a chat with me or anyone else. So, he's got his struggles. He didn't find the answer. And the other part of this is, well, I think Vonnegut always meant well. He had no idea how to write women in his books. It's a big flaw. Especially the earlier novels, they're often these kind of like vapid, like nagging sort of presences. They're not usually presented in a cruel way, but there is this sort of like masculine sense of like, women can't quite understand, or like I forget which book I'm paraphrasing. It might be good old Slaughterhouse-Five again. He mentions that a character is a nurse, and he says something like, and that's a great thing for a woman to be. And I'm sure what he thought he was saying is maybe women have often demonstrated more of a capacity for nurturing that he has seen men struggle with. Uh, but it kind of just comes out as this really limited view of what women could and should be. And it's a glaring problem in his books, for sure.
Yes, he is a gentleman of a certain time after all.
All right, Kris, thank you so much for walking Simon and I through our emotional connection to Kurt Vonnegut. This is the part of the podcast where I tend to jump into a synopsis and tell you about the homework. But first, I want to hit you guys with a little surprise activity. Don't worry, it's not as stressful as that pop math quiz you gave me a few weeks ago, Kris. Still recovering from that one.
Yeah, that wasn't cool.
Fortunately, my cousin Neil has not been exercising those bragging rights just yet after defeating me, but that's okay. I threw a little link into our notes, and it's just a link to a list of Kurt Vonnegut's 8 rules for creative writing. So I believe you guys are both seeing these for the first time tonight. Is that accurate?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. So Kris had a little bit more time to look at these rules. There are 8 of them, and I was just hoping we could each pick one that was our favorite. I have a feeling there's going to be something to appeal to each of us here. Kris, you looked over these 8 rules. Are there any that really jumped out at you as being particularly thoughtful or perhaps even accurate?
Yeah, I wrestled with 3 of the 8, but I settled on just one. Number 7, Vonnegut says you should write to please just one person. If you open a window and make love to the world, so to speak, your story will get pneumonia. Absolutely love that. In fact, maybe it speaks a little bit to what Simon was saying earlier. Like, you can't write to please everybody. When you do, you're going to please nobody. It's that way in the world, right? And how many stories are ultimately superficial or overcomplicated. They fail to communicate anything of real substance because they're trying so hard to have a little bit of everything that will please this type of reader or that or this movie goer or this TV watcher. I think we all ultimately love and are more passionate about the things that really resonate with us. And something that resonates with you super deeply is not likely to resonate with every other individual person quite the same way. If it's good and authentic and true, that should be the case. And so I think that this rule really resonated with me for that reason.
Absolutely, Kris. I'm gonna buy Simon another second here just in case he's still pouring through the choices. But we're both nerds. We love genre television and movies. And I think about that whenever I read this particular rule, right? Like, you hear about a film or a television show production getting all sorts of production notes from people on the business end, trying to see how many boxes they can tick off to make a movie or a show better. And perhaps there's been some business person who's made a positive suggestion at some point in the history of film and television. But it tends to be what hurts a production and hurts a story and takes away its fire and identity and purpose. Simon, let's move on to you. I accosted you with this list, but in the short time I gave you, did you happen to find anything that you found appealing?
Well, real quick, I want to comment on this number 7, right to please just one person. And I just can't help but see the parallel there with that ego you mentioned. So he says this so accurately, so nicely, but you can also tell that he really means it. Look at this metaphor. If you open a window and make love to the world, you're going to die. You're going to get pneumonia. You're going to die. So is this the guy that we're going to also try to convince to change something about his story? How do you think that conversation is going to go? No, he's right, because he knows who he's writing to. You can't change his mind. He knows exactly what he's pursuing. And it just, I see it kind of glowing through that example right there. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Love
Even
that.
though
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. I think it's a great tip. Luckily for the podcast, one of these actually jumped right out to me. And It's something that I'm going to like repeat. It was like a huge takeaway from reading the short story, which is number 4. Every sentence must do one of two things: reveal character or advance the action. This concept was perhaps my biggest takeaway from his writing, from this story. Let alone every sentence, every word, you could tell was etched out of stone. It had a purpose, and there was like this poetic element where some juxtapositions made me feel a certain way. And I was like, he did that shit on purpose. He wanted to create a feeling inside of me. So I know that he loves this rule and he tried to oblige this rule. So that's the one that stood out to me. Every sentence must do one of two things: character or advance the action. In short stories, it's so important.
Love that.
Yeah, I think you guys both absolutely nailed that activity. I love this list. I often use it in my classroom if we're reading a Kurt Vonnegut text, and we'll break these down a little bit. The one that often throws my students for a loop is number 8. Give your readers as much information as possible, as soon as possible. To heck with suspense. Readers should have such complete understanding of what is going on, where, and why, that they could finish the story themselves should cockroaches eat the last few pages.
I almost picked this one.
Kris, tell me why you almost picked it. In fact, something you said on a previous podcast inspired me to pull the rules up in the first place. So I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Oh, that's so funny. Yes. So it is. I know what you're referring to, because that's why this one resonated with me, and I really wrestled with it. I when I'm watching something or I'm reading something, and I can guess what that character is going to say next on the TV screen, or I know what is going to happen when I turn that page, even in a super suspenseful moment. If I know and then I'm right, I really just think that's a sign of great writing. It means everything that you're communicating is authentic and true to my lived experience, and I can kind of guess what's going to happen next, in the same way that in life you've seen a situation play out enough times, you're kind of certain the way a thing is going to go. I think you're really capturing truth when your story becomes a little predictable. There's nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely. Simon, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it actually makes me jump ahead to the little tidbit at the end. The greatest short story writers break these rules. And it makes me think of horror movies. And certain horror movies, the point is the gore. And the audience gets a kick out of being like, wow, that beheading looked really real. I'm nauseous. That was awesome. Good job. And then there's other horror movies where the whole point is that it's implied, or it's you fill in so many blanks, right? And I can imagine reading this tip, and it's just like, yeah, so what he's saying is you should show all the gore. No, you want your audience to know that the killer got that victim. That's what he's emphasizing. Don't leave this like ambiguity. Don't leave people guessing. Make your message clear, but you can accomplish that artfully.
Love that.
Yeah, Simon, I'm so happy you brought up that last tidbit, because you can kind of see that war within Vonnegut. There is a piece of him that has that ego, but there's also that openness, that humanity, that understanding, right? So for him to say, after giving these 8 rules with so much confidence and sarcasm and wit, for him to then say, the greatest American short story writer of my generation was Flannery O'Connor. She broke practically every one of my rules but the first. Great writers tend to do that, right? So ultimately, you've got to set your own rules. Thank you guys for engaging with those rules so thoughtfully.
That was a blast, bud. It was a good idea. Thanks.
Absolutely. All right, folks, it's time to finally get to the homework. I've been listing off novels and children's books, but Media Lit tends to go with something a little bit more bite size. So I picked a memoir Kurt Vonnegut wrote. It's called Wailing Shall Be in All Streets. This was new to both Kris and Simon, but they were kind enough to read it for me. And as I've said about 12 times in this podcast, my favorite Kurt Vonnegut piece is Slaughterhouse-Five. So I'm going to quote from that once more because it tells the story of the text we are going to be talking about. In the late 60s, Slaughterhouse-Five is released, and something Kurt Vonnegut says in that book is, "I would hate to tell you what this lousy little book cost me in money and anxiety and time. When I got home from the Second World War 23 years ago, I thought it would be easy for me to write about the destruction of Dresden, since all I would have to do would be to report what I had seen. And I thought, too, that it would be a masterpiece, or at least make a lot of money, since the subject was so big. But not many words about Dresden came from my mind then. Not enough of them to make a book, anyway. And not many words come now, either." So this was an effort over 20 years in the making that shook him for his entire life. Kurt Vonnegut once quipped, only one person in all of human history ever profited from the firebombing of Dresden, and that's me. And he wasn't bragging. There was a sense of guilt connected to that. So this piece was first published in 2008 in a collection of posthumous works. It was called Armageddon in Retrospect. And from what we can gather about this particular piece, it was probably written very soon after the war, or at the very least, the first draft was probably written just after the war. Based on the address that he listed that was connected to the manuscript, this was probably written between 1945 and 1947. So this would be still Kurt Vonnegut, the young man who thinks maybe I'm going to find a way to write about this and write a masterpiece. 23 years later, he will write a book that most people would say is a masterpiece, but I'm sure it's not anything like the book he imagined he was going to write once upon a time. And this is the first time the public saw this piece. And it was so helpful to me for this to just kind of hit the bookshelves just as I was about to teach Slaughterhouse-Five for the first time. So big part of my professional career. So here is a synopsis of this memoir. And then Simon and Kris are going to let me know if I failed to emphasize anything that really struck them. All right. Wailing Shall Be in All Streets is one of Vonnegut's earliest attempts to describe his time as a prisoner of war in World War II and his experience of living through the firebombing of Dresden, Germany by American and British forces, as well as his relationship with the aftermath of the attack. Kurt Vonnegut opens his memoir by recounting the memory of his basic training before he was shipped off to the European theater of World War II. He describes an atmosphere that was callous and demanded that the soldiers learn to commit acts of violence without honor. He also suggests that this callous, violent attitude was taught to civilians. He describes a couple of nice older women who gave him a ride when he was hitchhiking home after the war, who used racial epithets and were strangely interested in what sort of body count he racked up during the war. He goes on to suggest that World War II was fought for the right reasons, but that the policy of total war, including the bombing of civilian populations, was a step too far, that no logic could justify the actions of a military engaging in this brand of extreme violence, including the Allied forces. He paints a picture of Dresden as a hub of education, art, and science. He emphasizes that the city was a popular destination for refugees and that it lacked any significant military targets. From there, he digs into the bitter irony of his survival in the basement of a slaughterhouse and the physical and emotional trauma of being tasked with cleaning up after the attack. This experience tugs at his humanity and begins to numb his ability to see the humanity in the victims. Despite all of this, he insists on celebrating the humanity of the citizens of Dresden and even his German guards and captors. He suggests that every city on Earth deserves to be preserved and protected, and that any individual should be willing to sacrifice their own life to support that ideal. All right, folks, that's the synopsis. Simon, is there anything you would like to add to that synopsis?
No, I commend you for capturing it. I mean, it is such a nuanced but clear, and I think that's part of his craft. Memoir, short story. Those were, yeah, to me, that was a wonderful summary.
We're going to rename this segment Randy Fishes for Compliments.
Yeah. Well, I think you also might have worked hard on that too. Yeah.
Kris, anything you want to add or emphasize?
No, I mean, you took the words out of my mouth. I think that every week I'm always impressed by your ability to boil things down and put your own voice in it. Honestly, I think this was great. I think you captured two things that were interesting to me about the story, because the main thrust of the story being the attack on Dresden is really clear throughout. But two things that I picked up on, which you highlighted here, was that callousness of the civilian population, that strange conversation with the women in the car, and then again later, the kind of weird acceptance of celebration and praise that he had to live with, either from women like that or, Russian soldiers later, despite feeling horrid about what he had experienced and seen, having to kind of accept this weird perception that others have that he has to continue to interact with. I thought you captured both of those things really well here.
Well, thank you so much. All right, guys. So, this is a piece, Kurt Vonnegut did try to get this published. It was rejected a few different times. Made it back into the back catalog of the portfolio. We saw it again in 2008. That's kind of the story of this piece. I suspect maybe Kurt Vonnegut later in life might say that this wasn't a very good piece of writing, but it means a lot to me. Both as a teaching tool and just as a really direct way to get at what happened to him. If 10th grade me had this piece trying to write that Dresden paper, I think I would have gotten more out of it. I might have had a faster path toward really understanding the novel. But we're not here to talk about me. We've done plenty of that. Now, Simon, you are a Vonnegut fan, but this was your first experience with this memoir, Wailing Shall Be in All Streets. So I'm just curious, what was your first impression encountering this for the first time?
I almost want to apologize because it's sort of a technical point, but my honest answer is what stood out is his the way that he uses like the tactic, the writing skill of contradiction. He does such a great job of making two statements that directly counteract each other, that are both so sincere, so earnest, and true. And to me, that was like, it was so evident right off the jump. I think, one of the first things he describes is hitchhiking home, and the women ask him about how many Germans he's killed. And he says they're making pleasant conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And his heartbreak was so clear, and his biting sarcasm was so clear. But if you ask the women why they asked that, they would say, "What do you mean? I'm connecting with this young man that I'm driving home." So again, it's this sincere, earnest, but also bitter and judgmental all at the same time. I was like, man, he's really pulling this off. It was like every other paragraph. Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah, you just described the man perfectly. Kris, how about you? What were your first impressions?
Yeah, I'll echo what Simon just says, that bitter irony that's in him is really present throughout. And it's in some of these, the way he analyzes things through these contradictory statements. He'll go through this beautiful description of Dresden and why it was so important to him. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But then the very next paragraph is like, and then the Americans bombed it to shit. Like takes you through this beautiful, Simon, I think you used the word poetic earlier. And that was something that I was going to say as well, is his prose is very poetic. The language is emotional. It's descriptive. You can tell he feels the things that he's describing to you. And so, you get this really kind of poetic description of Dresden, and then just like the cold, hard fact to open the next paragraph. that thing I just told you about that I just made seem so wonderful, like you want to hold it up and protect it, it got bombed to hell in 2 days. It was 24 hours, it was over, not even 2 days. And so, yeah, his that biting irony and his ability to do it all with such beautiful language was pretty apparent.
Thank you guys so much. Now, I went into full English teacher mode on this one. Apologies. I couldn't even just give you one homework assignment. I threw a couple of other documents your way for you guys to take a look at if you had any interest. So there were two documents. The first one was a copy of the letter Kurt Vonnegut wrote home to his family after he was released from being a prisoner of war. At the end of the European campaign, the first time he was able to get word back to his family. Simon, did you get a chance to take a look at this letter?
One of the takeaways for me, and I think this is absolutely a product of like me reading it now. Like, I don't want to get like too English majory, but it's like, okay, do we just take a piece of writing at face value, or is it important to understand like the context in which it was written? And what this letter home really, really like just solidified for me is that this was a man who actually lived this, and this is how he navigated life. That what we get out of this memoir of him simultaneously understanding that the Nazis had to be stopped is just as sincere as that was an abuse of power, that was unnecessary and that was shameful. And the letters home like really solidified that for me, because that's how he talks like to his own family.
Yeah, absolutely. Kris, how about you? What was your experience with that letter? And did you make any connections between these two pieces of writing?
Yeah, I mean, I was particularly intrigued to read when he actually got to the bit about Dresden. And he keeps it really short and sweet. He doesn't go into the details, the gory details like he does in the memoir of their job afterwards of having to remove bodies. But he does very directly. You can already see in this letter home, his opinion is almost apparent. When he describes this event, he gives you the number of casualties and the amount of time in which it happened. This many hundreds of thousands of people in 24 hours. He doesn't go further than that, but I'm sure if you're his loved ones, you're reading that and you know exactly how he feels about what he experienced. And then something else that stood out to me in the letter home, you can tell in the memoir that there's a sense of guilt that he has for both being attached to the military effort in general, for the part that he had to play in this. But in the letter home, more than once, in fact, he repeats it almost like a literary design throughout the letter. He'll describe horrible conditions that led to death. And then he'll say, but not me. Many died in these showers, but I didn't. But not me. And you can tell that isn't a brag. It's heavy, it's heartbroken, and it's guilty. Like maybe the letter reads a little shell-shocked when he keeps repeating not me. Like he's not quite sure what to make of it yet, that he survived all of this, that somehow he's on the other side of it, and he's writing this letter finally. He's being paraded around and given great hospitality and entertainment, he says. He's due for a decent furlough with a nice stipend. But you can tell that he's shell-shocked by what he's experienced.
All I wanted to say about this letter is what strikes me about it is that it's such an outline both of Wailing Shall Be in All Streets and even Slaughterhouse-Five. You can map that letter to the chapters of the story. You see these patterns. And then, Kris, you stumbled upon something that's maybe the most famous stylistic element of the novel Slaughterhouse-Five. We don't get the phrase, but not me, but there is a very similar phrase that's repeated many, many times throughout the book. The phrase is, so it goes.
I've definitely heard that in the zeitgeist or whatever. Now I understand where it comes from. That's funny.
Yeah, and he says it every single time there is a death in the novel. And he says it whether this is a deeply emotional death of one person. He says it if it's a description of a mass death, like the firebombing of Dresden. He says it about microscopic organisms dying in the delousing showers when he gets processed as a prisoner of war. He even says it metaphorically about a bottle of champagne that's dead when he pops the cork. So the way this functions as a draft is really interesting to me. The biggest difference between the letter and later Vonnegut is there's this one line. He says that he was kind of selected as a group leader. He had some German heritage, so he knew a tiny bit of German, and he's kind of a largely built, confident sort of guy. But he says, after desperately trying to improve our situation for 2 months and having been met with bland smiles, I told the guards just what I was going to do to them when the Russians came. They beat me up a little. I was fired as group leader. And that jumps out to me because there is so much bravado in that. Uh, so much of the sense that, I can imagine this guy holding his own with the other soldiers, having his buddies, having that support system, having some strength and confidence. But 23 years later, when we get to the novel, we get this intro in a fictionalized Vonnegut's voice, but the main character is a guy named Billy Pilgrim, who is inept and lacks all social skills. He is alone. He's isolated. He can't build positive relationships. He is hopeless and pathetic as a soldier. There's some different articles. There is a real life person that is kind of cited as the main inspiration for this Billy Pilgrim character. But as far as I'm concerned, it's the part of himself he was always hiding, that vulnerable piece of himself that he couldn't get to yet. And maybe that's what took 23 years to come together for him, is that, that there isn't a beautiful version of this story. All right, Simon, I'm going to go back to you. I probably should have shown some restraint, but I also sent you yet another Vonnegut letter. This came a bit later on. It was a letter he wrote to a school district that burned copies of his book, which sounds bad, and it is bad. I will give the school the tiniest bit of credit in that, to say book burning evokes like a large ceremonial thing happening in the town square, whereas I guess they would more routinely dispose of things in the fires of the school furnace. So it wasn't like a public display of burning Vonnegut books, but nevertheless, they really put one English teacher through the ringer. It created a hubbub. They moved a bunch of kids out of the class of this teacher and ultimately burned copies of the book. And Vonnegut did not like this story. Simon, did you learn anything new about Vonnegut from this letter? Did it influence your take on him at all?
For me, well, first of all, it was depressingly relatable in that this is like an ongoing issue. I feel like he said it so passionately, eloquently, convincingly, but I get like his main point is that why are we choosing ignorance? The people in charge should not be telling the younger generations that being naive, not understanding, we can't be setting that standard. And I feel like a little bittersweet about it because I think I can picture this version of Vonnegut. I mean, obviously I didn't know him, but he just let this go. And it makes me think of the quote you were just saying. And so it goes, it's like, yeah, if you're going to be a writer, if you're going to have swears in your books, there's going to be ignorant parts of our country. They're going to burn them. But he is just such a fighter. He is so earnest. He truly believes that this letter is going to be like an action of change, convincing. And imagine if more people were like that. And I think that's what he would say. And so you just got to give credit where credit is due. That what was in his control in that moment, he's going to explain his perspective, explain what was so offensive and horrible about what the school did, because that's what he can do. And he actually did it.
Hmm. Kris, how about you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think some of my takeaways are pretty similar there. I think, like, I love the idea that he wrote this letter to this person looking to inspire some change in the circumstances, right? To compel the school administrator to see the error of their ways. But he also highlights in the letter that he didn't go to the press. He hasn't given interviews on this. There are probably other avenues that he could have taken with his voice, with his positioning, at least the way he writes the letter, it sounds that way, that maybe would have been newsworthy. You know, maybe he could have gone through channels that today we would think of when you want to inspire change, get the message out, mobilize people, get the interview on the talk show so that people know how you feel and they're all buzzing about it. It's not what he does. In righteousness, in his sense of directness, in his sense of humanity, he writes this person a letter. He says, this is between you and me. First and foremost, you personally offended me. And so I'm personally writing you to address that. And I love the humanity that's in that. That seems so apparent in the writing that I've read of his in this short story. And then again in this letter, that he cares not about his reputation at large, but he cares that this person who is too ignorant to even read the book that he's choosing to burn would behave in such a way, would insult him and would limit the intellectual potential of children by burning books. And so that sense of directness from him, that sense of righteousness was apparent, but also his real love for people. When he talks about why books shouldn't be burned, it isn't about the ego of the author. It isn't about like their hard work and their artistry and their voice being destroyed. It isn't about that. He has care for the children in question. And he's hurt. His offense comes from the idea that it's implied that he doesn't care for children or wants to warp a child's mind or twist a child's mind. This is a person who he highlights his service record. He makes it very clear he wants to be seen as a good citizen. And it's from that place of humanity that he's been hurt by this. That was all very, very potent in his letter.
Awesome. I assigned this memoir to you. This piece of writing lives rent-free in my head. There are so many moments that are going to stick with me for life. And I was thinking what we could do right now is maybe just kind of go in a circle, just kind of take some turns, sharing some moments from the piece that meant a lot to us, that are going to stick with us. This could be on an emotional level. This could be about historical significance. Simon's already had a lot of really smart things to say about Vonnegut's style. So, any things that jumped out to us for any of those reasons. Simon, you want to kick us off in our little roundtable quote discussion?
It's worth noting that I read it and then I also listened to it. And so just picture me walking my dog, cute little suburban neighborhood, right? No one knows what I'm listening to. And I'm waving to neighbors. And I'm just listening about the horrors of cleaning up piles of bombings. And anyway, the one that really stuck with me is I was a prisoner, I was hungry, dirty, and I was full of hate, but I loved that city and saw the blessed wonder of her past and the rich promise of her future. To me, that one sentence, which from the book reader, he chokes up while reading it. So it was like this absolute double whammy.
The audiobook reader chokes up as you were.
Exactly.
That's powerful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I feel like Vonnegut would have been choking up while conveying this sincerely anyway, right? So I feel like it was an accurate read from the audiobook reader as well. But this stuck with me. First of all, I think it just summarizes his point extremely poignantly, that again, he gives himself credit. He wants the audience to understand that he's not coming from a place of war should never exist or fighting is never necessary. He wants to actually have this incredibly difficult, nuanced conversation that, yes, even in Germany, they had this awe-inspiring utopia. And he even explains why it was a
Mhm.
utopia city. And we cannot live that way.
It's beautiful. I really appreciate that.
Mm.
Kris, what's at or near the top of your list?
So I guess I want to go a little bit further than Simon because um, I was really moved by that whole paragraph, and then I think I said earlier the opening sentence of the following. And so he's getting ready to describe this horrible night, but first he wants to convey the city. Dresden was surely among the world's most lovely cities. Her streets were broad, lined with shade trees. She was sprinkled with countless little parks and statuary. She had marvelous old churches, libraries, museums, theaters, art galleries, beer gardens, a zoo, and a renowned university. It was at one time a tourist paradise. They would be far better informed on the city's delights than I am. But the impression I have is that Dresden, in the physical city, were the symbols of the good life.
Mm.
Pleasant, honest, intelligent. In the swastika shadow, those symbols of the dignity and hope of mankind stood waiting, monuments to truth. And then the next paragraph begins. In February 1945, American bombers reduced this treasure to crushed stone and embers, disemboweled her with high explosives, and cremated her with incendiaries. Yeah, man, I had to reread that like 4 times the first time I read this because I was walking the city streets. Like I grew up in the suburbs, and more of my experiences trended towards the rural from there. And so I had like sort of romantic ideas of the city and what city life looked like. I loved any time I get a chance to go into Boston. And I think of culture, I think of art, I think of just all the wonderful things that humanity has to offer in this life. And so it's all there. And I was so moved by his description. I remember the gut punch of the next paragraph, especially because he continues the metaphor of describing the city in the feminine, referring to the city as her. And so when his poetic kind of prose continues, where in that metaphor they disemboweled her with incendiaries. Man, I was so bummed out reading that.
Yeah. Yeah, you guys both picked things that are really close to the top of my list as well. And there's a lot of powerful stuff in here. There's some upsetting and some graphic stuff in here. But whenever I think of this piece of writing, there's one image that pops into my head first. And here it is. Our guards were a melancholy lot. Most of them were Dresden residents and had friends and families somewhere in the Holocaust. A corporal, who had lost an eye after 2 years on the Russian front, ascertained before we marched that his wife, his 2 children, and both of his parents had been killed. He had 1 cigarette. He shared it with me. And the visual in my brain is so strong for that, to be that destitute, to realize you've experienced a tragedy that, this guard sounds like he has not had enough time to fully process this information that he's putting together. And it's superseding whatever this World War II conflict is all about. He's walking side by side with this American soldier, and they can share a cigarette. I'm not a smoker, don't smoke, kids. But that's a pretty intimate sort of thing that you would share with someone, to be in that situation. And it's so remarkable to me that could happen to you, and you could not be acting with hatred in your actions in that moment. I don't know if I'm a big enough man to be able to have that sort of peace of mind. If I ever found myself in a situation where I had to find that peace of mind and I managed to do it, It's going to be because I read this essay, because that's just such a beautiful, beautiful moment. Whew. You
Yeah,
guys
it's
have
so
any thoughts
human.
on any of those round one quotes that you want to piggyback on? You guys both articulated stuff so well. I don't think I have anything new to add, but if there's anything you want to jump in on, feel free.
I just love the example you gave, and like one of the, I guess like I don't want to call it a motif. I guess just one of the things that
Hmm.
I feel like Vonnegut wanted to accomplish and did was he's like, I'm not gonna let myself or the reader regard the Germans as animals, as less
Mm,
thans. We have to acknowledge I'm going to make myself and the audience and even the military face the reality that these are people. And there is so
Hmm.
much effort put into viewing them as this like unacceptable, truly evil thing. And he's in such a unique position of having these like credentials, literally being
Hmm.
a soldier. And he doesn't let that poison his perspective. And that shows in this piece. You see it in the example you just gave, describing the loss and the heartbreak of his captors and then their generosity. And you
Hmm.
also see it when he mocks the attempts of the US military with the pamphlets.
Hmm.
They send the pamphlets down, and we got to face that was there was a meeting about dropping those pamphlets. That was an actual sincere attempt by a certain section of our all powerful US military that they'll understand. We will bring them some comfort when we explain that we were just trying to bomb these railways and that it's just an unfortunate, unavoidable consequence. He wants us to face that. And he does such a masterful job of acknowledging why he wants us to face that while also saying that the Nazis had to be stopped.
yeah, I really love that example for similar reasons. In that moment where he shares the cigarette, um, actually, that line stood out to me when I first read it, but it almost made more sense after reading his 8 rules for creative writing. I know this is a memoir as
Mm.
opposed to creative writing, but that sentence, it, it, it could feel out of place in a story because there's no further details about the cigarette or that person. It's just a passing moment, but he includes it because it communicates character. So he
Hmm.
tells you a little bit about this other soldier and then subverts your expectations of how that person might feel about him by sharing the cigarette. And just the fact that he accepts the cigarette and that this was such a meaningful moment to him that it's in his memoir communicates about his character. And so it's this like little line that is sort of just a blip on the radar of the overall narrative, but it's so powerful and so potent in communicating very real human things. So I think that's a wonderful example.
Simon, did you have any other candidates on your list for moments you wanted to take a second to highlight?
One that stood out to me, and this is, I mean, it was very powerful, like in the reading of it, but I think it was just like, wow, what a slick decision. Again, he probably, if I had to guess, it came naturally to him because I feel like he's such a sincere writer. And this is literally a memoir. But he compared, like, how dare he? Like, I'm a good boy American. And he compares the bombing of Dresden, the fire bombs, etc., to the atom bomb are like
Hmm.
most respected. It's like that's like blasphemous. It's like, what do you mean? That was the
Hmm.
most powerful thing. And then in the same paragraph, make sure that the reader understands that all of the pomp and circumstance, all of the tragedy and the symbolism that we have attached to the Blitz, more people
Hmm.
died in this Dresden bombing. He emphasizes it. It's in that same paragraph. And I feel
Mm.
like that is just so potent. because he took like the biggest symbols of World War II, the use of the
Mm-hmm.
atomic bomb and the unending, cruel, ridiculous blitzkrieg. And he was like, yeah, just so you guys know, this thing that we're trying to sweep under the rug, that we're trying to act like was just a necessary part of this, was actually technically more devastating. And we need to talk about it.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. Little details sticking in my brain from my 10th grade research paper. I would need to go back and redo this research to get better information, but I believe some of those incendiary bombs they dropped on Dresden were basically an early form of the napalm that would come to define the Vietnam conflict so much. And there's something meaningful in that to me because I keep talking about Slaughterhouse-Five. If you look it up on Wikipedia or whatever, it sounds like a World War II book, and it is, but it's just as much, if not more so, a Vietnam War book because it's coming out in that environment, in that world that's come to be in the last 20 years. So yeah, there's something timeless and thoughtful there. Kris, do you have another item on your list you want to get in here?
Yeah, and actually, that's a really good segue to it. I'm glad you brought up Vietnam because, you know, most of the wartime storytelling that I've been exposed to in my life, I came up in the 90s, and I think I've said before I was exposed to some films maybe earlier than I should have been. So, like, I watched Platoon, and I watched a lot of Vietnam era films and things like that, as opposed to like rah rah propaganda. A lot of the wartime storytelling that I was exposed to growing up had an edge of protest to it, an edge of the reality of the horrors of war. The idea that the men that we call heroes are actually being asked to commit horrors out in the world. I think a lot of the wartime storytelling I've been exposed to has talked about the shell-shocked soldier, the broken man or woman who comes home from war of all they've seen and experienced. The idea of post-traumatic stress syndrome and things like that is a very real part of how I've always been talked to about war, told stories to about war. And so it really stood out to me in this when he's describing their long trek on the other side of the bombing of Dresden as they make their way through the wreckage, as they're going about their grim work. He describes a quote from a British soldier that he came across in a makeshift hospital. The soldier was describing what it was like to be in those desolate streets, and he says, "It's frightening, I tell you. I walk down one of them bloody streets and feel 1,000 eyes in the back of me head. I would hear 'em whispering behind me. I would turn around to look at 'em, and there wouldn't be a bloomin' soul in sight. You can feel 'em, and you can hear 'em, but there's never anybody there." We knew what he said was so, right? Like, Vonnegut is describing this trauma that the soldier's living with, that just walking in those streets and being haunted then presently in real time by the ghosts of the horror that had occurred around them. And without having walked side by side with him, Vonnegut in one sentence captures how very real that experience was. We, and I don't know who the we is, but we knew it was so, he and his fellow soldiers. That really sat with me because in general, we tend to paint with broad strokes, right? We talk about the army, the enemy, but they're individual people who make up the army and the enemy. And each one of them is taken to an extreme end of their humanity. And I don't think very many are out to commit acts of evil. I don't think very many are participating because they really would love to be violent in the world. I think that most soldiers enter into the thing with good, noble intentions, right? Doing a good thing for the right reasons, but it all leads to horror. And that's captured really,
Absolutely.
really beautifully in this British soldier's quote.
Absolutely. So my next quote, I think this is the last quote that I could not talk about this piece without bringing it up. Just has to do with, the corpse mines of Dresden. Now I'm gonna spare our listeners having to rehear some of the more graphic descriptions, but what I'm really fascinated by is the psychological effect on the soldiers. Um, because Kurt Vonnegut, he is calling out the United States and Great Britain. He is calling out even the airmen who carried out orders that they were given. But he doesn't release himself from taking responsibility, right? So he's being sent down into these corpse mines. At first, they are being asked to carry bodies out of these corpse mines. Um, and they develop this callousness, this disconnect from the task. And I think it's the only way that they could survive. Kurt Vonnegut says, when we had become used to the darkness, the odor, and the carnage, we began musing as to what each of the corpses had been in life. It was a sordid game. Rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. And they don't know what to do in this situation but joke. And that gets even sadder because later in that same paragraph, he explains it was not so with the first of them, especially the young. We had lifted them onto the stretchers with care, laying them out with some semblance of funeral dignity and their last resting place before the pyre. But our odd and sorrowful propriety gave way, as I said, to rank callousness. At the end of a grisly day, we would smoke and survey the impressive heap of dead accumulated. One of us flipped his cigarette butt into the pile. Hell's bells, he said. I'm ready for death anytime he wants to come after me. It's dark, and I don't say this just to bring out what's depressing about this piece, but if you're confronted with that day after day and it becomes commonplace, you really can start to lose touch with your humanity. So to see Kurt Vonnegut like grasping to get that back means a lot to me. All right.
Mm.
We each shared two quotes that were really valuable to us. I could go for another 3 hours, but I probably should not. But do any of you guys have a quote you're still sitting on that like you couldn't live with yourself if we moved on, if we didn't dig into it?
I think I'm reading this story in like a particular time in my own life. So just for context, I am like a licensed social worker. So I'm a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest buzzword or one of the biggest like headline grabbing pop psych things going on right now is the male loneliness epidemic. And like in general, there's like a statistically proven mental health crisis, etc. I'm not trying to get into like the politics of it, but there is so many themes of, again, the nuance, the seeing both sides, the excuse me, that was my cat, the acknowledgement of triumph and horror. And I feel like, I don't know if maybe I'm looking too much into it, but there's like the theme of like what it means to be a man and what it means to handle yourself while digging up these bodies. Like, is that a manly thing to do, to make jokes about it, to cope in that way? And I would venture to say that Vonnegut successfully conveys both his rationale and his acceptance of his role in it, while also saying what parts were unacceptable and placing blame and saying, I want to make these changes. I want you to make these changes. And I just admire that nuance, specifically from this gendered lens. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it is telling, right, that the whole thing is a challenge. It's a challenge to systems of how we conduct ourselves in the world, I think he seeks to really highlight here that, in pursuing justice in the world, the Americans have sought to become as cruel as possible. And to your point, like there's a certain masculine messaging about that, about what it really means to conduct yourself and do what's necessary for the greater good, right? Perhaps it would be seen as laudable that a person's able to conduct this work, because it's all in the name of a greater good, of a justice. But he doesn't accept that. He doesn't want to accept that. He doesn't want anybody to accept that. It lives in the last sentence of the memoir, that he states how he feels, and he's not shy to say that I think everybody should feel the exact same way.
Mm-hmm.
That I think that the callousness is very clearly meant to illustrate a lack of humanity as opposed to some virtue of humanity.
Yes, Simon, I couldn't agree with you more. And thank you so much for bringing your expertise into this as someone who's working as a therapist. But yeah, that question of male identity, it's right there at the beginning, right? Kurt Vonnegut's description of his drill sergeant teaching him to fight without honor, and that's how we win this war. Never hit a man above the belt when you can kick him below it. Make the bastard scream. Now, I'm not a military man, nor am I a great authority to comment on military strategy, but that's certainly not the tone I would like to imagine in this situation. So that I know that would shake and rattle me if that were my experience having been drafted into a war.
Do you guys know the influence for the title, where this comes from? It's like a loose quote, a paraphrase from the book of Amos in the Bible. It's Amos chapter 5, verse 16. And there it says, so the book of Amos is all about, he's a lesser prophet or a later prophet. And he's sharing his message in a time where Israel has split. And like most of Israel's prophets, he's coming to point out to Israel's leadership and its people the way in which they've lost their way. His particular angle, Amos, the prophet, is really heavily concerned with highlighting the hypocrisy of Israel, meant to be a vehicle of God's blessing to all nations, but instead they have become the image of unrighteousness. And particularly, he highlights how their unrighteousness affects the vulnerable, the poor in society, how the powerful, the wealthy have become calloused, and it's affecting the lowest people in society. And he's talking about how God's judgment will come for this. So in verse 16, he says, "Therefore, this is what the Lord God Almighty says, there will be wailing in all the streets and cries of anguish in every public square." He's talking about the day of the Lord and how Israel will face judgment because of this hypocrisy. Just like Vonnegut is looking to highlight throughout the story, this hypocrisy in the American military machine. These heroes who are entering this war to fight the evil Germans, which Vonnegut isn't shy about qualifying how desperately the Nazis needed to be stopped, how unequivocally right the Allies were in the war. But the way in which they go about it is so contrary to the justice and peace they want to see in the world, right? The great evil that they're fighting against is the very evil that they are now embracing and becoming themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't ever mention the title elsewhere in the memoir. He doesn't really give justification for it, but something about it, I was like, what is that? That's familiar to me. And I went and I looked, and I wasn't surprised to find that it was so tied to the greater theme of the memoir. All right, now that we've dug into the broader themes, if we've dug into Vonnegut's voice and his style, I'm curious if this memoir, for you, Randy, does it share any connective tissue with other pieces of media that you've cared about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's got its fingerprints on almost everything out there. From the layer of like light, silly references. Like I made a joke about the movie Disturbing Behavior earlier in this podcast. more recently, just last night, I was watching last week's episode of Abbott Elementary, and the principal, Ava Coleman, I think it was just like her week to go on vacation or whatever, and she was largely written out of the episode. And her whole plot line was she really wanted to get a copy of Slaughterhouse-Five and finish reading it. And they did not comment on it beyond that. She didn't really make any jokes about it. But people want to get that book in there. Because it's so important. But on a deeper level, I mentioned during a Lost podcast we recorded recently that The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien is one of my favorite books of all time. And if you don't have Kurt Vonnegut, you don't have that book, because Tim O'Brien is playing with time and trauma and the need to process, and the nods to Slaughterhouse-Five are just endless. I could go on and on. The other thing that jumps to mind to me is just the recent interest in the film Oppenheimer and the whole development of the nuclear bomb, and the responsibility that comes to that and what you unleash on the world. And the last one I had on my list, in terms of recent pop culture references, was a year ago we got The Last of Us, the television series. I never played the game, but within the first couple of episodes, we see Joel, our main character, performing a very similar task. He is placing bodies on a funeral pyre because they need to be disposed of in this world. And he's at that disconnected, broken point. He's the one who steps in to place the body of a child on this pyre. And my brain went straight to Wailing Shall Be in all streets. But yeah, this piece is everywhere. Vonnegut's everywhere. Noah Hawley is one of my favorite creators. He does the Fargo series. He did the Legion X-Men series. He's been connected to some different Vonnegut projects that haven't come to fruition yet. I'm still holding out hope. But I see it in there all the time. When I was writing about Fargo season 9 for the pop break, I used that same quote about Lot's wife because Noah Hawley had it in the script for a Fargo episode, a comment about Lot's wife, and I knew that Vonnegut DNA was in there. So yeah, anytime people are interested in exploring trauma or they're interested in humanity, Vonnegut's there somewhere in the background.
Simon, what about you? When you were reading this, did it call to mind anything else that you've loved in the world, movies, TV, or otherwise?
I was trying to think of characters in like basically major motion pictures that Vonnegut would have been. So like I was thinking about Saving Private Ryan. I was thinking about We Were Soldiers. I was thinking about like Platoon and Apocalypse Now. And I was also thinking about Game of Thrones, which I'm not super familiar with, but I was like, I bet these characters exist. And it's like this archetype of people who understand how unfair, cruel, disgusting war is. And they're going to somehow, in the midst of this, maintain their morality and actually walk the walk of that without succumbing to like the comfort of becoming an animal or maybe viewing others as animals. And I feel like any number of things comes to mind, but I gotta say, I never connected the connection. I think you said Noah, is it Howley?
Yeah.
That I love Legion. I played Last of Us, but never watched the show. And I love Fargo. And that just makes so much sense that that dark humor, social commentary, realistic, but also magical all at the same time. It is so obvious that is like almost like Vonnegut-esque. And
Oh yeah.
the fact that director who's involved with all these projects is the guy who's getting slated to try to capture that just makes so much sense. So that's just like a cool moment for me. to realize like that's the thing. Yeah.
Love that. I think for me, it really does live in the relationship to like the Vietnam storytelling that I mentioned before. Reading most of this story, I was surprised that it was a World War II story, right? I think historically, whether it be how it's taught or how it's exposed in pop culture, like World War II feels about as clean a black and white conflict as we get in war, right? Good guys
Mm-hmm.
and bad guys.
Which he acknowledges, right?
He,
He even says it. It was like, damn, we were the good guys. Also, maybe we shouldn't have done
Yeah.
this. But
Yeah.
please,
It
yeah.
was fought. It was fought for almost holy reasons, is what he says.
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. And yet his experience is so far removed from anything that's clear, that's black and white, right? And so as I was
Mm-hmm.
reading this, it felt a lot more like the Vietnam storytelling that I'm used to, which I've always been exposed to in a much more nuanced, critical way.
Mm-hmm.
Like that very first scene where he talks about basic training and being converted in that moment. Immediately I was transported to watching Full Metal Jacket, something that like really, really shook me as a kid. Watching what I understand to be an exaggerated but fairly accurate portrayal of an experience in basic training as we look to reprogram the human machine into the soldier. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, yeah, that was very, very present for me. Um, Born on the 4th of July, Platoon, the idea of just the trauma that comes with being a soldier, even if you believe in what you're fighting for, there's no
Mm-hmm.
shaking the human experience when you're in the viscera, right? He describes wading through that basement, that first place that they had to clear out, and literally wading through just a gross slop of all kinds of things. That again, that put me on Hamburger Hill. It brought me to some of these gory wartime
Mm-hmm.
films that I was exposed to as a kid. Um, yeah, really, really surprising to me to keep reminding myself that this was not a later war story. This was a World War II story for those reasons.
Mm-hmm.
All right, guys, this has been incredible. I mean, I feel like I've taken at least a brief course on Vonnegut. But where do I go next? Where do I go from here? Do I read Slaughterhouse-Five? What is the very next book or story that should be on my agenda? Randy, we can start with you.
Kris, if you've got a novel in you, obviously I've got to say Slaughterhouse-Five. However, I think Simon might have gotten it right all those years ago with Man Without a Country. Um, is that what you were going to go with again, Simon?
No, I have a curveball recommendation. So you're good
I
to
love
go.
it.
Yeah.
Listen, you're going to get the George Bush era politics, but I think we've proven here that Vonnegut can speak timelessly about
Mm,
issues. But most importantly, you're going to get an essay where Vonnegut digs into this sort of lifelong motif of trying to chart different authors' storytelling styles and kind of mocking the chronological nature of a lot of that storytelling. So it'll be a fun little window into his style for you.
very cool. I'll take it under advisement. What about you, Sai?
So mine is like much more leaning to what I was talking about before, where I was like surprised to be like, wait, are we talking about like men's mental health in this story? And that was just like this vibe that I could not escape. So I'm gonna recommend this author, Raymond Carver, and he has a short story called "Tell the Women We're Going." And first of all, I would recommend it because it packs such a punch rather, sorry, with terse minimalist language. It is extremely grounded. It's almost like boring by design. And it's because if I had to guess, he wants it to be very, very relatable. He wants it to be real. And thematically, it's about, for lack of a better word, and I do not use this word lightly, the horrors of the
Mm-hmm.
patriarchy, the downside of having stunted emotional intelligence, absolute shit communication skills, and no coping skills. no way of self-soothing or creating a community, or your community is just like-minded, scary people, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost picture like maybe not a high school class, but imagine being like you're at like Sarah Lawrence in New York and
Mm-hmm.
you're taking a literary class and it's like, all right, let's read some short stories about men and see what these two authors, and I would pair these two together. I think that they both just say so much.
Okay. Thank you both for your recommendations. I feel smarter for having just heard that pitch. So thank you. I will certainly look to read both.
All right. So, guys, I think we did it. Simon, obviously, I want to thank you for coming on the show and just bringing so much brilliant insight. Between the two of us, we got Kris reading some Kurt Vonnegut, so that was a great success. Um, I just had the absolute best time meeting you and chatting about Vonnegut. So, thank you so much for coming. And Kris, thanks so much for inviting Simon on.
Oh, it's totally mutual, bro. This was fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
I used the phrase friend of the pod at the beginning, but I was just being friendly. A couple of hours later, I can say you've earned the title. I'm excited to have you back with us.
I second that emotion. Absolutely. Before we head out, Simon, do you have any like social medias or public ways you want people to get in touch with you if you're interested in that, or any sort of like projects or things you want to share with us?
I am so flattered that you're asking, but no, I am chilling. I learned that lesson as a young buck in the therapy world. I want to not exist. I want to be very, very neutral. I don't want to go down that route. So you want to email me, you can find me. It's just my name at Gmail. But I don't think I post pictures of my daughter on a private account. That's the most social media that I do. So I'm good. But thank you so much for asking.
I'm about to go nuts plugging things. I just want you to know how much I respect that, and I think we'd probably be living in a happier world if more of us followed suit.
That is statistically backed. The more photos that a couple posts, the more likely they're struggling.
Absolutely. Kris, is there anywhere you would like to be found on social media and or any sort of projects you want to talk about tonight?
You know what? Normally I defer this question pretty quickly, but actually this time I'm excited to report that a short film I worked on about a year ago has just finished its final edit and is getting ready to
All
enter some
right.
festival circuits. So it can't be found yet, but stay tuned for The Irish and the Italian, a little Boston story based on true events in the 50s that I'll be able to share more about in the coming months. But in the meantime, folks can find me as always on Instagram. I am at Kris_Ingersoll. My name is Kris, spelled like Kringle.
Kris, I'm so pumped to check out this film once it becomes available. I will certainly be lining up to check it out and offer you my support. As for my socials, you can find me on Twitter at Mr_Elaine, ALLAIN. That's also kind of a hub for a bunch of different other websites and things where you can check out entertainment writing and different things like that I've been working on. You can also find me on the Pop Break Today podcast feed on a little podcast called Every Pod You Cast. We are making our way through the full discography of the Police. And one extra special plug is I recently went on another Pop Break podcast called Socially Distanced for their 200th episode, where we went deep into an 8-person Marvel Avengers draft, where we each created our own team of superheroes. And it was just a wild time, an absolute blast. So if that's your kind of nerddom, just definitely check that out over on the flagship Pop Break podcast, Socially Distanced. We will certainly see you here next time, but I'm going to talk us out with one more Slaughterhouse-Five quote from the character Billy Pilgrim. If you protest, if you think that death is a terrible thing, then you've not understood a word I've said. Now he closes his speech, as he closes every speech, with these words: Farewell, hello, farewell, hello.